Okay, well, lecture 9 is going to be a discussion about the niche as well as estuaries and marshes. What you see is just some pictures of some organisms that are typical of salt marsh areas and estuarine areas. And I just put those in because they show some diversity in the different habitats that might be present, as well as some of the population abundance that is there. And I put in that orange anemone at the lower right-hand column to just get it on your radar, because you're going to be hearing a lot more about that as seasons go on. Long Island Sound has just some remarkable diversity in it, and it's very little studied because it is so sedimenty out there, meaning it's very tough to see things underwater. But let's start with a discussion on the niche and the abiotic factors that affect species distributions. Now, we might be aware what those abiotic factors are, but those include anything from wind, temperature, climates, etc. You are all affected by these forces, and they do play a role in your survival, obviously. But many marine organisms are also affected by them. And this is kind of a review. But there are biotic factors as well, including competition between species, which would be interspecific competition, or within a species, which would be intraspecific competition for some kind of resource. Now, what resource out there might be limited? Well, it can be anything from space to food items, to just any resource that an organism needs to survive could be competed for. There's also predation that takes place where one predator may partially eat or wholly eat one other organism. So remember, that could be partial, because some organisms do have the ability to regenerate. And there's also symbiosis, which this is review for you. There's mutualisms, where both species A and B benefit. Commensalisms, where species A benefits, but there's no effect on species B. And parasitism, where species A benefits, but there's a negative effect on species B. So these are just a review of the abiotic factors and biotic factors that affect a species. Now, what this boils down to is, excuse me, it helps produce what's called a niche. And the niche, is not pronounced niche, is the total of all relationships that bear on how an organism copes with both biotic and abiotic factors. This is a good definition question for the next exam. And the idea of the niche was proposed by G. Evelyn Hutchinson, who was a professor at Yale. There's a picture of him there in his later years. Just a brilliant guy, only had a master's degree, but he was so brilliant that Yale hired him on as a full professor, and he spent most of his career there. So to G. Evelyn Hutchinson, the idea of the niche was essentially it's the role that you have in your environment, whatever that role might be. You have a niche. You could be a student, you could be a soldier, you could be a son, you could be a father, you could be a brother, a sister, aunt, whatever. It all depends on what your niche might be at that particular moment, but your niches change. Now, there's two types of niches that you should be aware of. The first is called the fundamental niche. And the fundamental niche describes essentially all the environmental conditions that are suitable for you to live a really good life and without any kind of competition or predation. So imagine you go to, I don't know, a deserted island somewhere, and it is paradise. There's tons of food, there's tons of space, everything is set up for you. If it's you and a few other people, your population is going to explode, meaning you'll just have everything there to support future generations. Life is good. Now, usually we don't live in a fundamental niche. We live in what's called the realized niche. And the realized niche is in the presence of competitors and predators and limited resources. So it's very rare that we have a population that lives in areas where there are just unlimited resources. But if we look at this graphically, graphically you can see that the fundamental niche, life is ideal. So you have species A living very large, okay, so the size of that circle based on the two environmental gradients that might be present. That's good, okay? It's not usual though. Some organisms that live in their fundamental niche could be invasive species, where they arrive here in some foreign manner. They get here, they realize, wow, look at all this food, and there's nobody to eat us. Let's just start reproducing like crazy. And they do. Okay, so they have a fundamental niche until some point sets in when they either start competing with each other or they start to die out from disease or anything like that. But if you look at B, this is the realized niche. And life is not ideal in this niche. So you can see species A is now in competition with species B and C, and their slice of the pie has gotten a lot smaller. That's the realized niche, where life is essentially not ideal. But I want to keep in mind that by being in the realized niche, you get to be better competitors, because there's an arms race going on between the three of these species on who is best at getting the space or the food or whatever it is. So you tend to get better. Whereas for species A in the fundamental niche, you're kind of like laissez-faire, you can be kind of lazy. Whereas in the realized niche, you tend to increase your likelihood of competing better and better and better as time goes on. Now, when we look at a lot of these marine habitats that organisms live in, they pretty much cover all different aspects of our planet. Okay, what you see here is an estuary. And this is just a typical estuary. You can see the marina and the buildup of that coastal area. You can see the sandbar out there. You can see all the sailboats, the boats that are moored there. And there's a channel. And if you look upriver there's other towns that you can see in the distance. But all of this estuary has a lot of freshwater input going into it. Okay, this affects where organisms live. I put the picture in of the manatees because the manatees are found in most estuary habitats throughout the tropics, from Panama all the way through Florida. And they just kind of hang out there. They eat some seagrasses. Life is good. And in the lower right-hand column, you see the estuary, where you have a lot of fresh water that's working its way toward the salt water. In this sense, Long Island Sound is a perfect estuary because of the Thames and Connecticut and Quinnipiac and Housatonic and all the different rivers that empty out into it. So you have this fresh water input into the estuary that continually changes the salinity in those habitats. So estuaries are very simple. They are partially enclosed coastal embayments where freshwater and seawater meet and mix. They have a very important function because they are nurseries for a lot of juvenile organisms that then leave the estuary and become adults. They are highly variable, meaning temperature, salinity, all kinds of runoff. These communities change rapidly, and in some areas of Long Island Sound, you have some that are beaches that are called spits because they basically change shape and formation, several times over the course of a decade. And they vary so much that they are different than the open ocean, which is almost constant throughout the year. So if you compare salt or estuaries to open oceans, you see some drastic differences between the two. So estuaries, there are four main types. There's a coastal plain, which was formed at the end of the Ice Age. There's tectonic, where the sea reinvades the land due to some kind of subsidence of the land, where the land went underground and the water just invaded again, like San Francisco Bay. There are semi-enclosed bays or lagoons, which typically have sandbars built up around them. You see this down south a lot throughout North Carolina, Texas, and the Florida Gulf Coast. And you have fjords, which is a valley deepened by glacial action and invaded by the sea. So Long Island Sound. typical glacier-carved estuary, and you can see that from the area on the race where you can see all the little deep carvings that are moved out. You can also see the remnants of those carvings if you just follow the rivers up all the way up to Canada, in the Connecticut River's case. So Long Island Sound is an estuary. It's semi-enclosed. It's got that small area, and that's where a lot of fresh water and salt water meet. Now, this would be a bay or lagoon. This Pamlico Sound is a good example of that. So you can see the area of land there that separates the ocean water from the estuarial water. It's semi-enclosed because there are openings there. And you can see some of the rivers that would empty into that sound. So this is a typical bay or lagoon. You have a tectonic estuary, which is San Francisco Bay. So if you look at that area right where the Golden Gate Bridge is, that was a landmass some time ago. And that slowly subsided back underwater, and the water basically just flooded in, creating San Pablo Bay and San Francisco Bay, Suisun Bay, etc. But you also have the Sacramento River running directly into that. This is a very good example of a tectonic estuary. And now we probably have one of the most beautiful examples of estuary, which would be a fjord. Now this is from Fiordland in New Zealand. If you ever get a chance to travel to fjords, please do so, because they are absolutely beautiful. They're just glacial rocks, or the glaciers, when they retreated, left these huge depressions in these rocks that then filled with seawater. And that seawater is just regular seawater. It's exactly what you expect. Many of the habitats are very similar, but those sheer rocks go straight down, sometimes for hundreds and hundreds of hundreds, if not thousands of feet. That's remarkable. I have a friend that studies fjords in New Zealand, Hans Smith, and he showed a video one time of dropping a dive light from the surface, and you saw the light go down, go down, go down, go down, go down. And when they finally retrieved the light, which they had to use a ship to do, and a remotely operated vehicle to get to, it was 2,000 feet deep. But when you look down through the surface, like right at the surface, you could see the light coming straight up, and it looked as though you could just swim down and get it. And that's just remarkable. Beautiful, beautiful habitats. Very good example of a fjord. Now, you do have positive and negative estuaries. Okay, and I want you to, this doesn't mean that they're good and bad. This just means it depends on the amount of salinity and where that salinity actually resides in the habitat. So you have a positive estuary when evaporation is less than runoff. So it's positive if the runoff is greater than the evaporation. So what that means is that you're going to have a higher salinity downriver, because so much fresh water is being pushed in that the farther you get to the more saline water, the higher the salinity is going to get. Now that kind of makes sense. Okay. Now you can have a negative estuary where the evaporation, is greater than the runoff. And when that happens, you have a higher salinity upriver. So if things evaporate quickly on the surface, more salt is left in the water, and it's redeposited in the water, so you have a higher salinity upriver. So you have these two types of estuaries out there, and if you think about how that's going to affect species distributions, well, it's going to be obvious effect, because the species distributions are going to be affected by the salinity that may be present in those habitats. And if you can handle the salinity, you're fine. But if you can't handle it, you're going to want to move away from those habitats. So you have positive and negative estuaries. Now, some of the generalities, because they change so often, that does create stressful environments for them, for the organisms. The salinity changes with every tidal cycle, every rain event. Temperature changes seasonally. You might get eutrophication, where there's an overabundance of plant growth because of too much nitrogen. And that's okay when the plants are all alive and everything is good for them. But when they die, they decompose and they further remove oxygen from the system just through that process of decomposition. And that can lead to these events that are called hypoxic events, where the dissolved oxygen, or DO, is less than 4 milligrams per liter. And you might find these around primarily sewage plants, etc., but in Long Island Sound, the hypoxic events are moving from the western sound, where there's not a whole lot of water flow, toward the eastern sound. And this is getting worse and worse as years go on. So you have these salinity changes that take place with the tides. Obviously, when the tide comes in, at high tide, you're going to have a higher salinity upriver. And you can see that in the schematic, where the 15 PSUs is higher toward the right than the bottom schematic, where the tide actually goes out. So when the tide goes out, the salinity changes more toward the sea, so it kind of moves to the left on that graph. So as the tide comes in, salt comes in. As the tide goes out, salt moves out. Very simple process. So salinity does change with the tide. With the salinity might come organisms that can handle the salinity, move up. As the tide goes out, they try to get out. Hopefully they get out in time, or they move with the tide. Because if they get stuck there, well, then they're under stress. And their biology might have those constraints that, is a limitation that doesn't allow them to survive in those habitats. So salinity is usually higher at the mouth of any estuary. So if you look at this estuary here, this is the Chesapeake Bay, which is another semi-enclosed body of water, hence it's an estuary. And if you look at the salinity numbers from the mouth of the bay at 25, as you go up the bay toward Baltimore Harbor, the salinity gets less and less and less. And hence, would that be a positive or a negative estuary? I'll let you look back a few slides and figure that one out. Now, they're also highly productive. There's a diversity of producers in estuaries, and there's a lot of nutrients available. The producers include microphytes and macrophytes. The microphytes are the phytoplankton, or any unicellular algae like diatoms or dinoflagellates. The macrophytes include everything from all the different marine algae that might be present, any kind of marsh grasses that might be present, or any seagrasses that might be subtidal. So they use these nutrients to grow and reproduce. And a lot of these nutrients can be natural, just through the decomposition of certain, species, or man-made. A lot of estuaries are surrounded by farmland where we throw a lot of fertilizer in that happens to get, used by these plants for growth and reproduction. And that creates what's called the nutrient trap effect. And this is based on literally the physical nature of a semi-enclosed body of water. It traps nutrients in. So if you go back to that Chesapeake Bay slide and you look at it, well, it's not always as cut and dry. If there's a lot of nutrients in there, it takes a long time for the tide to come in and to flush that entire area out. And the flushing time is the number of tidal cycles it takes to flush a system, which could be in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tidal cycles before a system is properly flushed. So in estuaries, because these are particle-based systems, you have two basic food chains. This makes a great question. Compare and contrast the two basic food chains in an estuary. They're either grazing, where plants are eaten while they're alive, or they're detrital, where plants are important only after death. So once the plants start to break down, smaller organic particles remain and are used by other organisms. That's called detritus. Now, in in an estuary system, historically, the marshes are the most important part of estuaries. But now we also know that because we have a better understanding of phytoplankton and where they're found, in estuary systems, we know that phytoplankton are also important. And you just read that paper about how temperature, nutrients, and predation affect phytoplankton populations throughout the sound. Now, how do the organisms change? Well, this is a figure that demonstrates the number of species versus salinity. And it breaks it down into two basic types of species, or three really. You have the freshwater species on the left-hand part. That can live, freshwater species can live in salinities from 0 all the way to around maybe 15 or so. That's that purple line. But usually they're transitional, so they swim back and forth. If they don't like the salinity in an area, they're going to keep looking around until they find something that's more freshwater. Then you have the lighter blue euryhaline species. Now, eury just means that they can tolerate a huge change in salinity. And if you look at the euryhaline, triangle there, it goes all the way from 0, or basically freshwater, to around almost ocean water, or 25 PSUs. So these would be called euryhaline marine species. They're transitional again. Okay. And within those euryhaline marine species, you find a particular type of species called brackish water species. They can live from freshwater, or a salinity of 0, all the way to around 20. Now, after you get to a salinity of 30, you hit the stenohaline marine species, where they can't really tolerate changes in salinity that well. They like 30 and above. Anywhere in that range is fine for them. But if they get trapped in a euryhaline habitat, or where the salinity is lower than 30, they're not going to thrive, they're not going to do well at all. So you have multiple comparisons that you can make with this one graph between freshwater, brackish water, euryhaline, and stenohaline. Think about the definitions of euryhaline and stenohaline. Many different types of estuarine animals out there, from snails to crabs to polychaetes to mollusks. All different types of algae are present in all of these: enteromorphas, chaetomorphas, cladophorus. And a lot of these can be found in salt marshes as well. Now, this is a salt marsh. This is a picture taken of the salt marsh from Guilford, Connecticut, which is absolutely gorgeous. The train tracks run just to the bottom of this picture, which is kind of funny. But when they put in the Amtrak trains throughout Connecticut, they filled in a lot of marsh to do so. Now, marshes tend to be simple communities. They tend to be easy to manipulate if you're ever going to study them as well. Marshes are found worldwide, and they're not usually distributed in the tropics too well. But you can see for all areas in the red where they're found. A lot of people look at Australia and think, oh, it's all tropical there, but not really. The southern parts of Australia are very temperate in nature and would be considered cold temperate habitats. But if you look at the United States, marshes are found everywhere from Hudson Bay all the way through New England, through Texas, on the entire West Coast, all the way through Alaska. I mean, we're almost completely surrounded by marshes in our country. If we look more closely on how extensive marshes are, what you find in the eastern part of the United States, as you go from Maine on south through Florida, you can see that the area of marsh is dramatically more in the south than in New England. So in Maine and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, you have these little blips of marsh that are great. I mean, I just showed you a picture of the Guilford marshes. You can walk along the coast of Connecticut and find marshes almost everywhere. And then they get more pronounced through New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and then they really kick in around North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. That's a lot of marsh, almost the entire coast of many of those areas. That's not beach, is marsh. There's no rocky intertidal there, though. Okay, so what's this pattern? Obviously, from north to south, marshes increase in size. As you move more south, they get much larger. Why is that? Well, none of those marshes down south are affected by winter down there. And in winter months, a lot of ice settles on marshes and destroys them. But also throughout New England, it's more rocky intertidal habitats than salt marsh habitats, especially in Rhode Island and Maine and Massachusetts, whereas down south you don't find many rocky, intertidal habitats. Okay, so that's the first lecture on estuaries and salt marshes. We're going to pick up on salt marshes again for the next lecture.